We are starting this discussion formally. Hello, everyone. I am Ritam Datto, and this is the fifth episode of Victorian Sundays, which is a podcast series hosted by Victorian Vanguard. And before starting this initiative, we already have Peter Lang as our publication partner, so we will collect selected papers and then we will publish a volume after that. So if you wanted to publish with us or if you wanted to be part of this journey, then you can send. And today we have a very special guest. We have Professor Dr. Munshi. Indra, would you like to introduce?
Yes,
Yes,
welcome
welcome
everyone to
everyone.
this episode of Victorian Sundays. Today's lecture will be delivered by Dr. Aritra Munshi. The topic for today's lecture is Theopoetics of Water from Crisis to Consolation in Select Victorian Poems. Let me introduce Aritra Munshi first. Dr. Aritra Munshi is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Raiganj University, West Bengal. His research interests span diaspora and migration studies and subaltern studies. Is the co-editor of Border and Bordering Politics, Poetics, Precariousness. His book chapter Marriage and Man-Woman Relationship in Coolie Diaspora appeared in Kalapani Crossings. He has edited in the book edited by Judith Mishra Barak. Uh, he has also translated Qazi Abdul Wadud, an autobiography published by ILSR, Kolkata 2025. He is currently working on a book project on Baul traditions under contract with Palgrave Macmillan. So welcome, Dr. Munshi, to this podcast or lecture. The stage is all yours. Kindly begin, sir.
Thank you, all of you. So, am I audible?
Yeah, sir, you're audible.
Okay. So, first of all, I would like to congratulate you for creating such a beautiful platform to share one's own thoughts regarding this area. And of course, I would like to convey my thanks to all the that means viewers who are watching the entire program, which who will be watching the program or who have been watching now for a couple of days. Okay, you are doing fantastic. Okay. So this is the thing which I'd like to admit at the very beginning of my lecture. And definitely, the topic, as you have already mentioned, is that the Theopoetics of Water from Crisis to Consolation in Select Victorian Poetry, rather. So, before entering into the details of the title, right, the Theopoetics of Water and all, I would like to concentrate on the Victorian period. Okay, what actually happened during that time, and why I have chosen this term like from crisis to consolation, right? So this is what I would like to focus on at the very beginning. So first thing is that if we just try to look at Victorian period from the official perspective, we know that it started from 1837. Am I audible?
Yes, 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 sir.
Okay. It started from 1837 and ended in 1901. But the thing is that, as you all know, the Victorian period is usually marked by doubt, dismay, and confusion, as we all know, because on the one hand, people used to believe in God. On the other hand, we know that aggrandization of the industrialization, science or scientific technologies encroach upon the human consciousness. So, what happened? People are caught in between. So the industrial revolution, which started in 1760s and then it continued up to 1830s or 40s onwards. So we find the agrarian perspective was completely changed because that was replaced by urbanization, as we all know. And the aggrandization of these, the mechanical reproductions of these, that means the technologies of the scientific innovations, is accentuated by the publication of the book Origin of Species that was published in 1859 probably by Charles Darwin. And what actually happened because of the publication of this book, we know Darwinian socialism actually talked about or created rather a kind of competitive antagonism among the people. Okay, so because they're very much preoccupied with this gross materialistic desire emanating from these materialistic world. So then what happened? The emotion and the imagination, this particular that means characteristics of the human mind took the backseat because of the aggrandization of this scientific innovation culture. So, if we just try to look at the romantic poets as well, we know the romantic poets also tried to escape themselves from the hubbub of these kind of civilization in order to get find refuge from these. During that time that French Revolution was going on. So, in order to get rid of from this kind of turmoil, they wanted to take refuge in the lap of nature, right? So why this kind of escapism happened during that time? If we just try to analyze it from the philosophical perspective, we know that what actually happened. Because empirical philosophical school during that time, say for instance, John Locke or Hume, they talked about an important aspects. The thing is that the aspect is that everything, whatever we are observing, that is the only permanent thing. Because through our sensory organ, we are experiencing something, and then we are coming to a conclusion that this has a kind of the valid existence of that object. So that means our mind becomes a kind of the passive recipient of the external stimuli, whatever we are deriving out of it. But so there is no activity of mind. But Kant onwards, we know the entire thing is getting changed. Why? Because Kant is a philosopher who is talking about a very interesting thing. This is what is called the empirico-transcendental doublet. That means he says that there is a kind of the a priori concept which is very much embedded within our human consciousness. What are these a priori things? Time, space, and causality. Okay. So then what about the a posteriori? That is something talking about the transcendence. That means imagination started from that particular ground. That means our mind becomes active from Kant onwards. So we find that lots of romantic poets are just trying to hinge on imagination or emotion in order to get rid of from these turmoil, okay, that was going on during that time. Now the question is, you might think of that why I have referred to this kind of things. Because if we just look at the Victorian poets, you know that they have also been suffering a kind of the spiritual crisis. So most of the time you find that they have just tried to shift their attention towards a kind of the imaginative aspect. Say for instance, here I have tried to focus on water. So water here appears a kind of the image, right? So water appears a kind of the theopoetic space in which poet wants to negotiate between the crisis and the divine existence of God, while they are caught in this kind of the conflictual relationship coming out from the scientific innovation on the one hand, on the other hand, the existence of God. So water appears a kind of, that means image, which will help them to move beyond the already given existence of this world, because they have been suffering from a kind of crisis, spiritual crisis, so to say. So water is almost fluid like the human consciousness. So if water is hindered, then it will die out after a particular point of time. And if consciousness is also hindered, so that will also be will be afflicting from that particular situation. So we cannot hinder the consciousness like the way we won't be able to hinder. We should not hinder the flow of the river or the sea or the water. So here we find that water appears here in a manifold ways here. Water may appear as a malevolent force or benevolent force or the sacramental aspects. Okay, so it appears to be that means a kind of the mysterious force which is considered as sublime. Okay, so my point of view here is that I would like to focus on these theopoetics of water from the Indian philosophical perspective, because we know there is a kind of the Christian ethics and the aspects. Already we know, but I am thinking completely little bit in a different way, which I will try to in course of my discussion. In course of my discussion, is that how I can speculate on water or can concentrate on water from Indian philosophical vantage point. So in this connection, I would just like to take up two important philosophical aspects. One is the Vedantic philosophy of non-dualism. Another one is the Buddhist principle, the Buddhist concept of avidya. So I will talk about that. But before entering into that discourses, we should know that what does Advaita Vedanta philosophy talks about. Advaita Vedanta philosophy talks about the non-dualism. That means water is tantamount to human consciousness, right? And while water is compared here in this connection to human consciousness, so human consciousness is termed in Indian philosophy as Atman, right? So Atman always tries to mingle with Brahman. Now the question is, it's not a very easy process. It's a very intricate process, as we all know, because it's a process which usually happens inwardly at the back of your mind. When a person has been suffering from a kind of the crisis, he or she can identify himself or herself with the divine existence of God so that he or she can get transcendence from these mundane human existence. Now, the question is, we might say that is it so that only the God? No, not only the God, but you can also make a connection with the nature. As we all know, Wordsworth has done it. Okay. And of course, we know how our this particular theoretical aspects has inspired American transcendentalism, as we all know. So there is, we also find that how there is a kind of the identification between man and the nature. Okay. Of course, there is also a kind of connection between man versus man. In Whitman, we can also find a similar scenario. And to be more precise, if we look at Tagore, we will find the similar scenario. Tagore says, জীবনে জীবনকে যোগ করতে না পারলে কৃত্রিম পণ্যে ব্যর্থ হয় গানের পসরা. That means he talks about the kind of the connectivity, connection. So through which you can attain a kind of the force. Okay. That vitality, that force will direct you to move on towards a particular direction which you are asking for at the back of your mind. That is coming out unobtrusively from your consciousness, right? So in this connection, in order to emphasize this consciousness or the Atman or the Brahman, this kind of scenario, I'd like to refer to a beautiful story that has been taken from Katha Upanishad. There is a story, there is a child whose name is, there is a boy, sorry, whose name is Nachiketa, who once upon a time met with the deity of death, that means Yama. So Mama wanted to give him gift, but he did not want to take any kind of any materialistic gift. He is least bothered about that. But he asked him certain questions. First one is, what will happen when we will die? What usually happens when we will die? Number two is, what is the secret of immortality? So he was perplexed. He did not want to give this answer to him, but he stood firm in his questions. So he was bound to give him the answer. And the answer was, everything is within these all encompassing power of this Brahman. And while he also asked him to make a kind of the differentiation between the world where we are living, that means our lived experiences of this reality, and on the other hand, the Atman, he says that there is no division between the Atman and the Brahman. As we have discussed right now, the Vedantic philosophy of non-dualism, that there is a non-duality. That means our self is very much associated with this divine power because we need to understand it. Okay. So in a way, in a Cartesian philosophy, we are not separating the mind and the body here. Here we are, what we are doing, we are just trying to expand ourselves. This is nothing but a kind of the expansion because we want to transcend the earthly limitation. Okay. So here we also find the similar, the resonance of this kind of transcendence, okay, on the part of the poetry. Whenever we will be dealing with the poems, we can understand it very clearly. So we find that how the water flows exactly like that of the consciousness. Okay. So water here again appears as a kind of Sagar as well. Whenever we'll be dealing with the Indian philosophical perspective, we find often that how water appears here as a kind of illusion, as a kind of Maya, because it talks about the typical Indian philosophy of the karmic principles, which is replete with birth, death, and again rebirth. So this process is nothing but talking about a kind of, that means a kind of the barrier, okay, which one need to understand, and one needs to trespass this boundary. So this world of Maya, you need to just trespass, okay. That is a very important thing, okay, which they wanted to just explore through their discussion. So we find that while we are talking about the that means the human consciousness, and which is something related to that means the river, or that means the sea, we find that the river or water should not be hindered, and human consciousness should not be hindered. And sometimes water here appears as a kind of, that means the a Maya, and sometimes it appears a kind of appears in a form of in a malevolent, appears in a malevolent force, in the form of a malevolent force, and or appears in the form of a benevolent force too. So here we find that how this consciousness, which we are, or the Atman, which we are trying to contextualize or recontextualize in this connection. So we need to understand or recontextualize our Atman in the context of Brahman, which is yet to be segregated. So water is yet to be segregated by imposing any kind of any barrier, right? So water here appears in numerous multifaceted forms, as I have said. So if we just look at certain poems which I have taken up for our discussion, then it would be clear. Okay. So now, if we cast our vision onto the poetry reading session and the analysis of the poems, certain poems which I have opted for today's lecture, then it might give us a clear perception what I am trying to do here. So, first poem which I have opted for much discussion is the Crossing the Bar. So, just if we just look at the title of the poem, Crossing the Bar, so you find that what does bar signify? Bar signifies this material existence of these human beings, and beyond the bar, you were thinking of a kind of transcendence. Okay. So bar here acts as a kind of threshold between the material existence of the human being and the transcendence, world of transcendence. So if you just go by the poem, you find that the poem starts with sunset and the evening star. That means the sunset and the evening star is symbolizing that poet is at the fag end of his life. But he wants to withdraw from these gross material human existence. How? Because he says in the next line, and one clear call for me. So, from where does call come? From where is this call coming? This call is coming from his inner sanctum. Okay, that means he wants to make a kind of the connection beyond this world with someone else, with the Almighty, brother. So he wants to have the transcendence from these mundane human existence. So that's why he says that one clear call for me, that means the self-realization. That is the most important thing. What kind of realization he has? That means this world is the world of impermanence. And the more you are associated with this world, the more you will be grappled with sordidness. Okay, despair. So the thing is that you should withdraw yourself from this gross materialistic world by merging yourself with that world. That means that the divine existence of God. So what happened? He says that may there be no mourning of the bird. He says that if I cross the bird, there is no mourning. He feels that he will die after a particular point of time and in no time rather. But that world is much more desirable to him than anything else. Because he knows that after the destruction of the human body, according to Indian philosophy, your body will take the form of the another human beings. That means it is something related to the formation of rebirth. Birth, death, and again rebirth. That is the principles one will be following according to Indian philosophical tradition. So we find that here he is waiting. He is waiting for the tide. The next line he says, but such a tide as moving seems asleep. That means he is waiting for the tide because that tide probably will push him to move on and on to reach his ultimate destination. So here the tide can be compared to the verbal battle going on between Arjun and Sri Krishna. Their tide can be compared to Sri Krishna, as if Sri Krishna is pushing Arjun to go beyond these earthly existence of the human world, because this world is nothing but talking about pain, frustration, love, so on and so forth. That will not give you the permanent happiness. That is very much ephemeral, okay, in nature. So you need to understand it. You need to understand it. So whenever you will be able to understand it, then you can have the possibility of going beyond this already given existence of this world. So Arjun did that. So here the poet probably is waiting for the tide, and the tide is pushing him to move on and on to reach his ultimate destination. Okay. So then we find that he again says, twilight and evening bell, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. So there is no question of farewell, as I have said, that because there is a chance of getting birth again after the physical destruction of the body. Exactly in a Hegelian way, you can say that দেহ মনের সুদূর পারে হারিয়ে ফেলি আপনার। তার কারণ এই আকাশে আমার মুক্তি আলো হলো, he wants to find the lease of life here in the midst of water, in the midst of the big sea, where he can have the possibility to mingle with the divine existence of God. Okay. So here he wants to transcend from these material human existence. And the poem ends with this line, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. That means what I was talking about, that he wants to meet with the divine presence of God, because he wants to have the celestial power in order to make himself enlightened. Because we know the Atman is enlightened by the Brahman. Okay. So Atman is very much immanent within the Brahman. So there is no segregation. So here we also find that how there is a, because everything is happening in the form of imagination. Okay. So what he is thinking to transgress this materialistic world and wants to have the association of God. Okay, and finally, by means of writing this poem, he has been able to do these, and he feels that this world is too much for him to live in. So he can find a better world while he will be able to meet with that absolute power, that means the God. So here we find that how the water has been given a significance in this connection. Okay, so in this way, if we just read the another important poem like Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, so you'll find that the Dover Beach is nothing but revealing as if a kind of Koruna Rasha of the poet, because the poet has been suffering from a kind of spiritual crisis. But though we apparently find that he is making he is lamenting over the segregation or the alienation, but he has a kind of, he wants to make a kind of the cohesiveness among the human beings. He has that kind of desire, but that has not been that was not possible during that time, according to him. So we find that sadness was very much there at the back of his mind, and this poem is nothing but the outlet of his frustration or the sordidness, whatever he had. So this poem is nothing but reflecting his Karuna Rasha, we can say. And we find that we will just try to discuss it from the philosophy of Buddhist philosophy. Okay, how? So if we just look at the poem, the very beginning of the poem, we find that the sea is come tonight. Now, my question is, will the sea remain calm? No, because everything is getting changed, because the world keeps on changing. So this is something related to the anitvava. Okay, anitvata. This is the transitoriness as propagated by Buddhism. Okay, so everything is impermanent and ephemeral. The poem starts with this kind of connotation. The sea is come tonight, the tide is full, and then we find that how it shifts, gleams, and is gone. That means the calmness, whatever the sea has, that has been smashed on the ground, because it becomes plain, it becomes pale, because gleams and is gone, which is associated with the Buddhist principle of anitya, or the impermanence. Then, if we just look at the other lines of the poem, we find that he says, "We hear, you hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and flee." That means the grating roar means the harshness or the repetitive attitude as performed by the human beings because of their preoccupation with this gross materialistic world is bringing in a kind of the frustration among the human beings in general. So one need to, that means he says that life is nothing but talking about sufferings. He says that জন্ম হলেই কর্ম করতে হয়, কর্ম থেকে আসে আসক্তি, সুতরাং জন্মই হচ্ছে মৃত্যুর কারণ। জন্মই হচ্ছে দুঃখের কারণ। So that means he says that life is nothing but talking about the kind of suffering. So again and again, the suffering revolves around throughout the poem. So he says that again, the begin, cease, and then again begin. So he talks about this cyclical order which the material human existence is following up. Start, finish, and again begin. So this is a kind of the humdrum he has been suffering from, because people are following up these things. And the eternal note of sadness. And if you are following this, that means moral principles of life that is coming out, stemming from these materialistic world, that will bring in frustration, sordidness, nothing more than that. So that's why he talks about the human misery. And again he says that the sea of faith, that means you did believe in faith. The sea of faith was there, but somehow it has been lost, because we know during that time what happened because of this industrialization and scientific innovation. We know that how the faith was lost, and I can only hear its melancholy, again the sordidness and naked shingles of the world, which is something related to Buddhist principle of shunyata, emptiness. That means he says that there is a kind of the lack of inherent coherence within this object. Okay, so that is why everything is leading towards a kind of the disillusionment, one's own excessive preoccupation with this gross materialistic world is leading one towards the concept called the disillusionment. But he wants to take refuge in love, but he says that, "Oh love, let it be true," because he feels that there is no constancy in love relationship. But according to Buddhist philosophy, the interconnected interpersonal relationship will meet your desire, but that will not help you to make yourself complacent in the true sense of the term. So that will also bring in frustration, sordidness at the back of your mind. So it would be better if one could take nirvana, because we know at the very end in the very in the at the very end line of the poem we know that he says that ignorant army clashes by the night, which is very much associated with the concept called avidya. Avidya means the illusion. This world is nothing but replete with the miasma of dream and desires. Okay, so one needs to dismantle or dissolve the torpor of these the gross materialistic desire. Okay, in order to attain that means nirvana. So the poet here wants to find a kind of the cohesiveness of the human beings in terms of faith, in terms of everything. But we find that by means of by referring to this sea, we find that sea here appears as a kind of maya. Okay, one needs to go beyond the sea, one needs to go beyond this already given existence of this world, that means these dreams, desires, in order to achieve a kind of the spiritual existence of the human beings. So he has been suffering from this kind of spiritual crisis, and he wants to find out the path so that he can attain spirituality, through which he can make a kind of the coherence between the human beings. But he falters again and again. But there is a kind of tendency. Through this philosophical analysis, we can prove it. Then again, if we just look at his another important poem, To Margaret, okay, continue. We find that this is a beautiful poem. And we know that the poem also to Margaret is talking about a very important theme of fragmentation. Because we all know that the island which used to be consist of that means the continents, but somehow in a way we know that this continent has been splintered into numerous halves, and each continent is trying to listen to the music of the birds, and that is happening in the other island. That means the each and every that means the island where people are belonging to, they are just trying to listen to the other things happening in the other island, because they wanted to make a kind of the unification of the human beings. But here water appears as a kind of the segregation. Here water appears as a kind of the segregation. That's why he says that estranging sea at the very end of the poem. He says the estranging sea. So he wants that water should recede, so that all the islands can enmest all together. Okay, so that they can have a kind of coherence. This is what he actually wanted to have. But here water appears again as a kind of the maya. So that creates a kind of the barrier or rebuff for the progression of the human civilization. So here we find that he says at the beginning of the poem, we mortal millions are alone. So mortal millions on the one hand, on the other hand, the alienated human individuals. He says that peoples are so enveloped within their own desires that they are not able to go beyond this already given existence of this world. So the coherence between the human beings, or the unification of the human souls can be made possible if water should be that means abundant. So here he wants ask for the elimination of the water, so that there is a kind of cohesiveness forged between the all continent as all the islands, which will give the enlightenment in the true sense of the term. So, if we just shift our discussion onto the another important poem, like "The Wreck of the Wasteland" by uh, Hopkins, we know that I'm not going into the details of the poem. Just for my analysis, I want to say that raking of that means raking of the sheep into the sea can be interpreted as a wrath of the god. That according to the Indian philosophical tradition, you can see that we are the sinners, we have done so many sins. So immersion into the water, the drowning into the water means there is a kind of the tendency. One is the wrath of the god, another is the sacramental qualities associated with water. Because because of the immersion into the water, the drowning into the water, is tantamount to the shedding of one's own ego. That is leading one towards this primordial consciousness. That after immersing, that means drowning into the water, you will die, but that water will purify your sins. Okay, and you have that kind of possibility of getting rebirth, taking the shape of the another person, as I have mentioned at the very beginning of my discussion, that your soul will be evaporated from the destruction of your body, and that will take a different, that means human existence, a different form of human beings, which is something related to the Janmantarva, as I have mentioned. So we can interpret it in this way. Another poem is that another important poem is the as kingfisher catch fire. If we just scoop the kingfishers from this poem, we find that there is a basic nature of the kingfishers and the dragonflies. This is what is called, according to Indian philosophy, Shobham. That means what kingfishers have, which other peoples or other birds don't have. So it has its own Shobhava. And what about his Prakasha? According to Indian philosophy, the revelation is the beauty, which is impermanent taking. But Kingfisher can be a part of, that means the Atman of Kingfisher can be the part of this Brahman. Why? Because Kingfisher always is in motion, because its activity is to catch fishes from the water. So while it has its own capacity, it has its own potential as given by the Almighty, so that potential or the power, whatever he has, that becomes much more powerful while it takes external stimuli from the outside world. The sun rays coming out from the outside world refracted through water and sound, and that makes it much more lower than it is. So that means there is no differentiation between the Atman and the Brahman. The unification of the Atman and the Brahman is giving that bird or rendering to the bird a proper shape. Okay, so we find that this is the potential of that bird which one has, and that becomes much more. That means power, that becomes much more colored by the assistance of the that means the Brahman. So in a way, we can discuss that how this consciousness is in fact is flowing from one person particular space to another particular space, and we know that the beauty of that part is not at all permanent. It is also going to fade. As Shakespeare says, the time will come and take my love away. Here we find that after a particular point of time, that beauty will be faded. Okay, so again, it is related to the impermanent human existence or the concept of the anitya. That means that will finish after a particular point of time. So to conclude my points of view, in memoriam we can have the similar scenario. I am not going into the details of it. Again, we find that how the Karuna Rasha is very much predominant here, because he has been suffering from a kind of crisis while he faces the death of his friend Arthur Hallam. He wants to have the association within the placidity of the sea. So again, we find that it's a journey from the crisis to consolation. So here, if we just try to look at the Theopoetics of water, we know that Victorian writers, while started writing their poetry, so again they started writing against the tide of this industrialization, the Armenian socialism. So water here appears as kind of the liminal space between the ignorance, between the finite and the infinite, the materiality and the spirituality. So here, water appears as a kind of the symbol. It appears in the form of benevolent aspects, or the malevolent aspects, or the sacramentality, whatever it is. But we know whenever Indian philosophical aspect has been added to it, it has its another kind of that means interpretation added to it. So what kind of interpretation is that? The consciousness is being compared to the what is compared to water, And of course, we also know that how the water appears here not only as a part of the natural object, but water also appears here as a kind of the moral teacher, so that we can be self-reliant. Okay, because this Vedantic philosophy of non-dualism is talking about to be self-reliant, to know your own self, because it's a very intricate process to think of your consciousness like that of water. So always you are trying to make a kind of the identification with the divine existence of God, be it man, be it natural objects. And we all know this particular philosophical aspects has already been taken up by the Arnenes in his typology. You can have the similar scenario. Transcendentalism was inspired by this kind of philosophical aspects. So here we find that always, while we are talking about this transition from this crisis to the consolation, we find that water probably helps one to go beyond this already given existence of this world, and of course pushes one to trespass the boundaries of this materialistic world. So again, after while I will be finishing my discussion, I would obviously like to refer to Tager, because Tager also talks about the similar thing by referring to two important things. One is the Choto Ami and Boro Ami. He says that while you are very much engulfed with the gross materialistic desire, it is limiting your existence to a particular periphery. But while even thinking of doing something for the sake of the common people, that means you are expanding your own self. So if we just follow this kind of practice, that will also help us to be compassionate about the people among to be compassionate with each other, which has a dire necessity standing in the present time, because the society what we are discussing about, it is Victorian society. There was a kind of conflict. Right now, standing in the present day situation, there is a kind of different sort of conflict. Conflict is always coming, the political, social, religious, so many conflicts are there. So because here or Dover Beach, we find that he says that ignorant enemy clashes by the night. That means people are killing people. And if you read Abul Fazl's book, interesting story, Manav Tantra, he says that Bag Bagher Mangsho Khay. That means Manush Manusher Mangsho. So we are killing people for the sake of our own benefit. So if we just try to analyze it in this way, we know that we can be much more compassionate with each other, and that would be the sole identity of the human being. So I think that would be the motto of our discussion, that we need to be compassionate in this trying time, in this trying hours. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very wonderful lecture. It was very enriching. And I know people will have multiple questions, but I observed one thing since you were talking about how water is significant in Indian philosophy. So there is this scientist called Jack Benevista who introduced this concept of water memory in 1980s. So it is very similar to how water is kind of integral in Indian philosophy, like how water can actually hold significant powers. So it kind of captures that essence. I think that's something that it reminds me of. And okay, so I'm opening this floor for other discussions and questions, but it was really great lecture, sir.
I actually had a question. Thank you, sir, for your rich engagement with Theopoetics. I think we really enjoyed it. But I mentioned that you kind of mentioned Vedanta, why in relation to transcendentalism, and how transcendentalism it kind of drew its inspiration from Vedanta itself. But I was wondering if this might, risk flattening some of the more complex ontological engagements of Vedanta, specifically, particularly in relation to Cartesian duality. I mean, that was the first thing that was coming in my mind. So, how do you see Vedanta's this non-dualistic framework, specifically Advaita Vedanta's notion of Brahmin and Maya, as you have mentioned earlier as well? How they possibly disrupt the Cartesian body mind duality rather than reinforcing them? This was the first question that I wanted to ask you. And the second question was, I really like that you mentioned Nagarjuna's.
Is it possible that one by one I will give you the answer? I think.
Sure, sure,
So
go ahead.
I think you were talking, you were just, you want to know from me the difference between Cartesian philosophy and, of course, the philosophy which I have discussed, right? Advaita Vedanta
So,
philosophy, right?
no, sir, I wanted to know that since you are drawing I mean, you are talking about Advaita Vedanta, and we know that Advaita Vedanta, the Purusha and the Brahma, how the disciple and the devotee and the person that we are offering our devotion to, these things get intermeshed with each other. So this very line of separation doesn't exist anymore. The Param Brahma lies within us. So this very separation between the disciple and the person that we are offering our devotion to do not exist. But in the Cartesian duality, you will see that the mind and body dichotomy is very much there. It's very rigid. So while we are talking about the Advaita Vedanta, you will see that ontological complexities are very much there in Advaita Vedanta. And the Cartesian duality completely negates it. So in relation to Theopoetics, how do you see this? That's what I
No,
wanted to know.
actually, yes. Actually, I have taken up Advaita Vedanta philosophy because it appears to be quite interesting for me that a philosophy which is not making a kind of the separation between the self and the other, right?
Yes,
The other
exactly.
Indian philosophical schools is doing that. So, whereas
Right.
the
Even
Shankar,
Dhwani
Vaimashti,
and Shankho philosophy, right?
yeah, exactly, they are doing that. But if we just think of Cartesian principles, we find that he says that mind is mind, body is body. But later on, he also just abandoned this kind of principles. He feels that if I am, say, for instance, I am hungry, then how is it possible for me to make a separation between my body and the mind? So that is something which is related to the Cartesian, that means fault. That fault Descartes has already admitted. So we find that if I just try to just look at the Cartesian perspective, the mind and the body, that means duality. So I think that will limit a kind of our discussions because I wanted to show here that water is almost like a limpid flow of a river. So I was thinking, while I was thinking of water or this poem, crossing the bar. So I wanted
Yes.
to think of water completely in a different way. Okay, the water is almost should be a kind of, there should be a kind of the continuity within the water. There should not be any kind of the hindrance. Okay, that should come out. Okay, so I was thinking of Muktodhara, so on and so forth. So I wanted to discuss it from a different sort of perspective because I feel that if I think of the problem from my own self, from my own philosophical angle, that means I'm trying to make myself united with the world because the poets are here thinking in terms of their own imagination. So what they are just trying to do, they have just tried to obliterate this binarization. So that is what I am just trying to speculate throughout my
Yes.
discussion. Like, this is my point of view. This is what I am trying to
Yes, sir.
see. If you can make a kind of the Cartesian perspective, you can bring in, but this is
I
my
mean,
point
it's
of view.
actually commendable that you try to situate your entire lecture in Indian aesthetics, specifically Sanskrit aesthetics. I mean, this is something that it should be more talked about. I mean, that is also a
Exactly.
method
There
through
is
which
no article or anything you
yeah,
can find
yeah. I mean,
because
this
I
is
have
also,
just tried
you should
to.
write a paper on it as well. I mean, this is the method through which decolonization also happens. I think me and Ritum, we were also talking about how it's very important to situate things in the Sanskrit aesthetics. And of course, yeah, I mean, it's pretty evident. There is not a lot of
So
written
whenever
about
I was reading that the transcendentalism, I find that there is a kind of connection between this
yes,
uh,
yes, yes, yes.
Vedanta philosophy of non-dualism, or if you just think of that deep ecology, you will find the similar scenario. Find that there
Yes.
is a kind of the connection. So we are not discussing all this thing in a way. So that's why I am thinking of discussing it in these
Yeah.
particular.
I mean, in deep ecology, if you see even in Wild Deleuze and Guattari, and if you read them, it's specifically they talk about a consciousness. So in ecology, becomes more important not to save things for their entirety, that saving water, saving trees because of their entirety, but it's more important to save them for the consciousness. So it specifically talks about building the consciousness. And I can understand that why it becomes very important to talk about Sanskrit aesthetics in this matter, because the entire epistemology of the aesthetics revolve around the entire idea of consciousness. But then it also becomes very important to segregate how specific idea of consciousness is also talked about.
Correct.
Yeah, another question that I had about you, that you also mentioned sunyata. So, as we see that in classical Indian theology, while Nagarjuna also talks about sunyata, we see that entire sunyata, as we are talking about theopoetics, no, I found that it's a very important point. Like, even if you're writing a paper in future, I think this might help you, that this is a gap that you can also, I mean, try to answer. So, if you see that the entire register of the sunyata philosophy, it's very negative. Theopoetics, by its nature, it's very positive. It's very positive. But sunyata, even when it's talking about a sense of emptiness that resides in the constitution, it resides in the constitutional framework, it's something that is not affirmative. But theopoetics register something that is very affirmative and presents for, right? So when we are talking about sunyata, which is a kind of sacred emptiness, which is full of negation, so could sunyata, while talking about theopoetics, can be seen as a poetics of absence or silence? So, I
Yes,
mean, that
no.
also becomes a very
Okay.
important question here.
But while I have brought in Buddhist principle of shunyata, that shunyata is usually coming out from one's own preoccupation with this gross materialistic world, and that is
Right,
leading towards a disillusionment. So he says
right.
that detachment is much more important. Say, for instance, if you think of bhakti poetry, you will find
Mm.
that they are segregating themselves from one another in order to have the association of divinity. Okay, so
Right,
again, there is a kind of segregation. Okay, we can make the comparison between them. But here we find this detachment is much more desirable. So the emptiness, whatever you are talking about, that emptiness will lead you towards moksha.
yeah,
So this
definitely.
is what I am just
But it is seen as
so
something
Arnold in this
negative.
connection
Exactly. Yes, sir.
negative, but that negation is not the absolute negation of, that means the negation
Yes,
from
yes.
this world, but withdrawing yourself to some other places. That you
Right,
need to negate yourself from this world, but in order to
right, right.
achieve something, you have to negate yourself from this
Hmm.
mundane human existence in order
Right.
to achieve some other important things. Because here Arnold is trying to find a kind of the spiritual solidarity among the people. But here in the poem, we find that only the sadness, but there is a kind of, that means he wants to have this kind of the unification of human beings, always there, right? I have tried to read it. Uh,
Yes, yes, yes.
so
Yeah, I
from
mean, that
this
was
angle, I
what, yeah, this is
watch.
this. I think this angle becomes very interesting because all the Western ideology. I was recently reading about the Oxford Englands. You must have read about that as well, because they also talked about mythopoetics, which is very similar to theopoetics. I think C.S. Lewis, another person, I forgot their name. So they were also there. They were specifically talking about mythopoetics, which is itself is very similar to theopoetics. C.S. I think Tolkien's was also a part of them. So where the like erotic love between human beings is also seen as something that is very sacramental. So we see that every form of theopoetics or mythopoetics has a very positive outlooks towards the narrative imagination. So, but Sunyata in itself also talks about Sunyata by itself talks about a negation, which can be interpreted as also as a very positive sense. But in the outlet, it's negative. No, so I was just wondering how does it work into existence. So
Negation
yeah,
of negation.
yes, yes, negation of negation. So yeah, you answered it beautifully. Thank you so much.
Our journey is almost like that. We don't even know where. Who knows the world end tonight? Almost like that. So it's
Right,
a
right.
journey. You are going on and on, but you don't
Yes,
know
yes.
where to.
I think I asked a lot of questions. I should give other people
Thank
chances
you for
to.
your questions. Okay.
Yeah,
I think we should
thank you.
reserve the convener's privileges and wait till other people have asked the question. Rajesh Devnath wants to ask a question. I will request Rajesh Devnath to unmute yourself and directly ask sir the question. Rajesh Devnath? Okay,
Hello.
okay. Yeah, Rajesh, yeah, you're audible. Kindly go ahead.
Am I audible? Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, yeah, you are audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. So my question is regarding what you suggested in your title, Theopoetics of Water from Crisis to Consolation. You already mentioned Arnold's Dover Beach, and I was also thinking about another poem by Tennyson that is Lotus Eaters. And considering both these poems, which the ocean where that once connected them to purpose and the divine, divine in the sense the Odyssean homecoming, becomes a symbol of spiritual apathy here. So, having a blend of theology and poetry that your title suggests, a study of how water is used symbolically in Victorian poetry to kind of explore theological or spiritual meanings. My question is about your subtitle, what suggests. Uh, the Theopoetics of Water from Crisis to Consolation. You already mentioned the about the crisis that and its tangibility in these poems, but I wish you could share a few more words on the consolation part. How these poems have been a very much uh, consolidating to the crisis that the Victorian people felt at that time.
Okay, as I have tried to say at the very beginning of my discussion is that Arnold talks about the segregation. Okay, talks about the melancholia. Okay, he has been suffering from due to his engagement with this materialistic world, but at the same time he has been suffering from a kind of crisis. That crisis usually comes out from the conflict between the science and the religion. That is for sure. But he finds that the sea, as I have mentioned, the sea of faith, which he believed that was prevalent. That means he believed in the integrity of the human consciousness. But that somehow has been smashed on the ground. Okay, that means he is lamenting. But he has that kind of desire to achieve that kind of consolation or the holistic aspects of the life. Again, if we go by the another poem, To Marguerite, we know he talks about, he has referred to the segregations of the islands from that means from the continents, but each and every island which is representing so many people, they also want to meet all together. So there is also, in a way, a kind of consolation which he wants to have at the end of his poem. So if you just closely look at the poem, you will not only find the melancholia or the sordidness he has just tried to celebrate, but there is a kind of touch of solidarity, human, that is signification of the human beings is very much there. Okay. And if we just think of the other poems like Crossing the Bar and others, we know that again there is a kind of, that means Tennyson wants to meet with the Almighty. That means he wants to have the consolation, wants to have the presence of God who can give him consolation to lead a different sort of life. So, in a way, if we just closely observe the poems, you find that there is a kind of resonance of consolation revolving around throughout the poems. Okay, so you have to analyze it from a very close perspective.
I think that answers
Yeah.
Rajesh's question. So, do you have any other questions? If you do have a question, you can just raise your hand and then you can directly go into the question. Do we have any other question? Okay, I guess not. So, Ritam, is there any question from your side?
Not a question, but again, like since you also mentioned that when Darwin was writing that book, Origin of Species, so during that time, even Victorian England, there was this thing called higher critics. The first generation higher critics were like Schleiermacher or others. Then in second generation higher critics, like figures such as Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote this book called Essence of Christianity, and then there were other higher critics, I mean second generation higher critics. So they also kind of created this situation where people started uh, questioning this uh, the faith of God, and so that's how it everything started. So it was like an observation that I just have. It was a really enriching lecture, and I really like the way you kind of connected everything. So it was a very interdisciplinary lecture, and I really
I
enjoyed
was
because
crying because I wasn't, because within this short time span, it was really difficult. If you write something, then it is different. But while you were saying something within 40 or 45 minutes, so then then it is quite difficult. Yes.
Exactly. It's really difficult,
I
but
really like the term when you used competitive antagonism